By now, it's quite clear that Budget 2019 had a very clear, if subtle, purpose. Because behind the hype on digital taxes and institutional reform, the real objective was this: to close the wealth and education gap as soon as possible. History has shown that societies with large economic and financial disparities descend into chaos, war, poverty, and years, sometimes even decades, of oblivion. Look at this chart showing the most unequal countries according to the Gini coefficient, which is a commonly used measure of income and wealth disparity. It's no coincidence that the bottom 5 countries are in Africa, where corruption, poverty, misery are rampant. So it's hardly surprising that uplifting the B40 is a major priority for this new Pakatan government, and that is not only appropriate, it is absolutely compulsory. So, on to Budget 2019. Call it a populist budget, call it a socialist budget, but there are a raft of measures designed to uplift the bottom 40% of society, designed to close the gap with the rest of the country. To help with daily financial burdens, there are measures that include financial help thanks to Bantuan Sara Hidup, targeted aid like fuel and electricity subsidies, monthly public transport passes, nearly 10 times the number of zero-rated items under SST versus GST, lower corporate income taxes for people earning ringgit 500,000 a year and below, higher EPF and higher life insurance tax reliefs, and to counter runaway medical inflation, a health protection fund that covers treatment for 4 critical illnesses up to a maximum of 8,000 ringgit, and a massive 2 weeks of daily income of 50 bucks to cover expenses for hospitalized patients. On the revenue side, there is a higher minimum wage ceiling of 1,100 ringgit, while to ensure there's adequate shelter, there are more affordable housing projects with property crowdfunding and easy Bank Negara loans at low rates for low-cost homes. On the education front, there are lots of measures to build a useful, high-value workforce. Note that one of the biggest ministry allocations, nearly a fifth of the entire budget, will go towards developing education, with particular focus on student assistance, upgrading existing schools, and building vocational skills-based training. Now, there's obviously lots more measures, but suffice to say, Saudara Lim Guan Eng, our erstwhile finance minister, is leading the charge to feed, clothe, care for, house, and school our poorer peers and bring them closer to the rest of the country. And that can only be a good thing. But like life, there's a flip side, some concerns. Well, actually, there are a few, and they're actually quite major. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, there was little imagination from the new government in terms of identifying a sustainable revenue stream. As Mizuho Bank's economics head, Vishnu Varathan, said before the budget announcement, Pakatan can no longer kick the can down the road on revenue compensation for GST foregone. The fact of the matter is that this revenue reckoning must come at once, whether or not politically convenient. Instead, Guan Eng used a special 30 billion ringgit dividend from Petronas to refund outstanding tax returns. And this is in addition to the 24 billion it is already paying to government coffers in normal dividends. So you can see the tightrope that Saudara Lim is treading. While the fiscal hole Malaysia is facing is not of his doing, it was inherited from Najib and his buddies, it still falls upon Guan Eng and his colleagues to deal with it. In fact, one can say that his job, Guan Eng's, is almost like a poison chalice, and he's on a tight deadline. Upon Budget 2019's announcement on November the 2nd, all 3 global ratings agencies voiced their concerns. Moody's noted that the heightened reliance on volatile oil revenues contributes to the weakening of the nation's fiscal profile. S&P noted that the risk to Malaysia's debt profile remains elevated, while higher, heavier reliance on oil is an additional risk in the absence of more structural revenue-raising measures. And Fitch noted that Malaysia's public debt is high relative to its peers, and a further increase in debt could have a rating impact. That any failure to stick to a more conservative fiscal consolidation path raises some concerns about policy credibility. So the clock is ticking. Trouble is, the new measures meant to help close the gap, things like the airport REIT, the sugar tax, the digital tax, or the higher casino fees, are unlikely to truly move the needle when one considers the massive shortfall of some 21 billion ringgit, even with SST fully factored in. In the meantime, though, the deficit continues to stay elevated. Barisan's alternative budget was also bereft of imagination, but it did contain one important suggestion, one that met the criteria of structural revenue-raising measures, and it related to the reinstatement of GST, albeit at a 3% quantum, half of what it was. Of course, this is not an option for Pakatan at this point, since they were voted in on the basis of removing this broad-based tax. So it appears that Pakatan have very little room to maneuver at this point, and they have another year before the same exercise, this exercise, crops up again this time next year. In conclusion though, Budget 2019 was not a bad effort, particularly in terms of recognizing the priority areas, but this coming year will prove crucial insofar as ascertaining whether Pakistan's election promises will prove their undoing. In the meantime though, we wait and we see, praying that the perfect storm of a global collapse does not coincide with our still fragile new government. Chair Seng.